Hey! The real question right now is, why do I always choose the worst weather to make my videos? The Polish autumn is really not the prettiest part of the year. It's pretty in a way that there's lots of colorful leaves on the ground, but it's constantly raining and it's getting colder and colder every day. And today is one of those days where it's windy and it's raining and the sky is gray and it's just not the prettiest outside, unfortunately. But today I wanted to share a few tips and hacks on learning foreign languages. I still use those tricks, let's call them that way, to help myself learn a new language faster. As some of you may know, I am currently learning Spanish. And besides Polish, which is my native language, I also speak English and German a tiny bit. I've spent quite some time learning foreign languages, and I know it's very time consuming and very frustrating sometimes. However, there are a few tricks to make the learning process faster and easier. First of all, a small trick that I think it was my English teacher, told me about a few years ago. Obviously, vocabulary is a very important part of a language. However, it might also be very tricky and very difficult to learn. My way of learning vocabulary is turning it into some kind of a memory game. You just take a small piece of paper and on one side you write the word you want to learn in your native language, and on the other side you write it in the language you're trying to learn. So, for example, what I did in here. The Polish word for dog is pies, so that's why I wrote it here. Here it says pies. And on the other side, I wrote it in English, dog. So, you make those tiny little pieces of paper, you cut them, and then you mix them all together in some kind of a box, and then you pick each one at random, and you try to guess the word in the language that's on the other side, if that makes sense. In that way you learn both translating from your language to the other language and from the other language to your language, which might seem silly, but trust me, it really helps you a lot, and I use that method through all my German education, at least English as well, but in German it was very helpful. And I sometimes do that with Spanish as well, and it's really helping me a lot. When it comes to grammar, for example, learning tenses, I have notebooks. I make notebooks for every language I learn. Besides the notebook I usually take to my classes at university, I also have one that's just focused on grammar. So in Spanish, verbs have different versions, let's call it that way, for each tense. So I have them all written down in my notebook, which is a very old notebook, and here it says English. In Polish it's język angielski, that means English language, but I use it for Spanish because why not? And here I make like different tables in which I write down all the kind of versions of all the verbs, because Spanish has lots of irregular verbs just like English, and that's very confusing. And it takes a lot of time to write these down and then to memorize them. I always mark the most difficult ones or the most irregular ones with a different color. So for example, in this case it will be red. I do that with Portuguese as well, because I tried to learn Portuguese on my own before I started learning it at university. So here's how it looks. It's pretty similar to Spanish, so it's not that difficult, but still, yeah, I spent quite a lot of time doing those tables. And I used to learn Italian on my own as well, which I stopped because now I want to focus on Spanish and then Portuguese. But as you can tell, I used to do that with Italian as well. Here it is. And it's very time consuming, and it requires lots of patience, but it's really worth it, because the more you write it down, the more time you spend on writing those tables. It really helps you memorize all of that. And when you go to your classes or when you're trying to communicate, you can just look into the notebook and all the answers are there. Also, I sometimes give extra classes from English to kids from primary school. In English, the tenses are completely different to the Polish ones. So Sometimes it's very difficult to explain them. So besides explaining, for example, when, in which situations you should use the tense, for example, present continuous. Besides that, you also need to explain the structure of the tense, of the sentences in that tense. So the way I do it is I simply just write it down. So let's say a present simple tense sentence. I go to school. I try to divide it into parts, I suppose. So a sentence in this tense is built like there's a person, which is I. Then comes a verb, which is go, and then is the rest of the sentence, which is to school. Which seems like a very silly way to explain it, but it works. It really works because most of the sentences you work on are built in the same way, at least in English and in most languages that I know. Maybe other languages have it differently, but I always explain to others like that, and when I'm confused with some tense, I usually write it into pieces like this as well, so that I can understand it better. It's also time consuming, but you know, no one said that learning languages was easy. It's just definitely worth it to write things like this down to see how this language works and how those tenses are built. Another tip that you definitely heard of if you're interested in learning new languages is listening to music and the language you're learning to get used to the language and to the way it sounds. However, I also always check the lyrics and the translation because it's just easier to memorize. Like, for example, there have been so many situations when I was in my Spanish class and I heard some verb and I was like, wait, I heard it somewhere. And then it turns out I actually heard it in a song. But you should be careful with that because obviously not all songs are made like with the correct grammar. For example, in English, songwriters sometimes decide to use do instead of does, which might be confusing for people who are just learning the language, because obviously you wouldn't say she do, you would say she does if you were speaking correctly, I guess. So you should definitely be careful with that, but I think to learn vocabulary it's a very good idea, and to just get used to the language and to the way it sounds. It's also very important to read as much as you can in the language that you're learning. It's definitely not easy at first because obviously you don't know all the grammar structures, you don't know all the vocabulary, so it might be confusing at first, but once you get used to the language, once you start learning it more and more, you'll see that it gets easier every time you read. You just really need to be careful with choosing the right texts to read, I suppose. You should always look for articles, not like some blog post or something like that. You should always make sure that those texts don't really include too much of like idioms, for example, because that could be very confusing for a new language learner. What I encourage you to do is go to a bookstore and buy a book. Wait, where do I have it? I have a few books from English and Spanish. Wait. That are focused on teaching, let's say that way. So for example, I have this book that I think I won in some kind of a contest, which is Round the World in 80 Days. You probably recognize it. And I think I read it, or at least some bits of it in Polish, but here's the English version of it. And there's different levels to it. So this one is level 5, which is 2,300 head words, and it's upper intermediate level. And after the book itself finishes, there's questions about it, about every chapter, to which you can answer to see how well you understood the text. And at the end there's a word list, which is the difficult vocabulary that a person at this level may not understand. And also I used to have a book in Spanish, I don't know where it is now, which really sucks because I really liked it. But it was a book that had like a crime story divided into a few parts, and after each part there were tests and questions about the chapter you just read, with explaining each vocabulary and sorry, my laptop turned off. With explaining each vocabulary and grammar rules, and it was very, very useful, and it helped me a lot, and it also taught me lots of vocabulary. So I definitely recommend it to you. You should go to some kind of a bookstore and look for those types of books. They're not really that expensive, to be fair. The Spanish one was like 20 zloty, which is about 5 euros or so. So it's definitely worth a try, especially if you're into reading books. The other tip I can give you is to keep on using the language, which at first also is very difficult and very stressful. But the more you use the language, the more fluent you become in it. For example, I learned German at pretty much, I think, since primary school, and I took it on my final exam and in advanced level for some reason, and I had 70%. However, I only remembered the basics at this point because I just don't use that language anymore. These are the tips I would give to you if you try to learn a new language. I'll keep my fingers crossed for you and hope you're gonna keep your fingers crossed for me, because I'm at this point of Spanish where I'm starting very difficult grammar and I understand nothing of that. So I really hope I learn it eventually. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope those tips were useful for you, and I see you in the next one. Bye!